We're going to look at 5 reasons why instead of the rapier, sometimes soldiers decided to carry the broadsword. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So this is a Spanish cup hilt rapier. This is a Spanish cup hilt broadsword of a type known as the Bilbao or Bilbao broadsword, and this is a type of, should we call it, militarized rapier. Now, I did a video about this recently, how I said this is not a rapier. Now, some people still want to call it a rapier because it's got this cup hilt on it, but let's be honest, this blade is a great big broadsword blade. This is the kind of blade that you could find on a medieval knightly sword or a Highlander's claymore, basket-hilted sword, or this kind of thing, various types of cavalry sword as well. And in fact, this is almost certainly a model intended for cavalry. We'll come back to that point in a second. But the fact is that Spanish cup hilts were absolutely favoured in Spain for dueling, for single carry, and they were sometimes carried in war. Now, I'm not just talking about the Spanish here. We could extrapolate this to the English, the Italians, the Swedish, all sorts of different people carried rapiers in civilian life, but then when they went to war, they switched to forms of broadsword and backsword. One of the most famous occasions when this happened, incidentally, was in the English Civil War, but it also happened in the 30 Years' War as well, so in the 17th century. So, given that this is such an awesome sword to fight one-on-one, we're going to look at 5 reasons why people switch to carrying these instead in war. So the first reason is the most obvious one, and that is that this sword can cut. Not to say that this sword can't cut, but this can cut a lot more impressively than this can. In fact, this one's blunt, so it can't cut at all, but let's assume that this was a real sharp version. Now, the simple fact is a very narrow blade can still have some cutting capacity, but overall it is very clearly a lot less able to give cuts than this sword. Now, why is that important? If this is fantastic at giving thrusts and thrusting through opponents and killing them that way, why is it important to be able to cut? Well, quite simply, in war, there are certain occasions when you just either want to or have to cut. Now, one of the most obvious situations where cutting is preferential to thrusting is against multiple opponents, or in a melee, in a scrap, basically. So if you have a bunch of people fighting around you, a thrust is linear. As soon as you commit to a thrust in that direction, someone over here or someone over there is a threat to you and you're not covering their line. When you give cuts, you're traversing distance through the air, and you can hit someone here and immediately be a threat to someone over there and someone over there. So moving the sword around with cuts was recommended in numerous fencing treatises, with the longsword and with one-handed swords, with all kinds of swords you can imagine. So one of the earliest examples I can think of is Filippo Vardi from the 1480s, and he basically says against multiple opponents, just keep cutting. Various De Grassi says something similar as well with the two-handed sword. So fundamentally, cuts are useful against multiple opponents, but of course they're also potentially useful in other situations as well. There might be your opponent might be wearing certain types of equipment, or you might be fighting someone on a horse, or you might be fighting on a ship wherein for some reason you don't want to just run them through with the point, you want to cut. And as we've talked about in previous videos, cuts do have some other inherent benefits, and that is when you hit someone with a blade, the blade is very unlikely to get stuck. The blade remains free. If you run someone through with the point, you have to get the blade back out again before you can now deal with someone else. So fundamentally, for all sorts of reasons, cutting in war is more, being able to cut in war at least and have some effect with those cuts is more important than fighting in a duel where you might be able to rely almost entirely on the point. So the next reason why someone might want to carry a form of broadsword, even if it's got the same style of hilt, rather than a rapier in war, is one you might not have thought of. It's durability. Now, durability can come in many, many different forms. One of those might be horseback fighting. So there were certain forces during the 17th century that did try to use rapiers as mounted swords. And it wasn't terribly successful. Yes, of course, you can ride at someone. Yes, you can administer your point to them. But on the moment of impact, and when that blade goes into the opponent, if it does go into them, then you've got the issue of what happens next. And you have to basically, your arm will get wrenched through and you have to extract the blade. Now, if we look at things like the British 1908 or the American 1913 cavalry swords, much, much later, they are not really like rapiers. They're really robust. They have got really thick and quite heavy blades to deal with these huge impacts of horseback fighting. So, a thin blade, even given with a thrust, is still liable to be bent or broken on the extraction, even though the point has gone in. Now, the second issue is armour. So a lot of people were still wearing elements of armour, things like breastplates and helmets and various other bits of, you know, kind of even full cuirassier armour, kind of like three-quarter armour in some cases, in the 17th century. But even forms of buff coats, for example, can be quite resistant. And the problem is, these blades, if they don't go through the armour, which is fairly unlikely if it's something like a breastplate or a helmet, are going to be prone to damage. So the very act of fighting against armoured opponents, which happens in war, but not usually in civilian life, is a real problem. So if you have a bigger, chunkier blade, it's more able to deal with that. So this blade is now better as a cavalry sword. Even on foot, it's better against armour. And finally, here's a curious one you might not have thought of. Lots of people fall over. I'm sure we've all seen those kind of scrappy fights where someone ends up on the ground. Well, I will tell you, I know a lot of people who have fallen on their sheathed swords. If these swords are in their scabbards at your side and you happen to bang into something, get bumped by a horse, get thrown to the ground, fall over, trip over, get it caught between your legs, a bigger blade in a scabbard is more likely to survive that than a narrower blade. So the third reason why you would maybe choose a broadsword rather than a rapier in war is sort of related to the last issue of durability, but it's a little bit, goes one step further than that, and it's to do with encountering opponents who have bigger, more powerful weapons. And that's actually really, really important. Now, while you can use, and in fact it's detailed in treatises, you can use a narrow dueling civilian rapier against things like poleaxes or massive two-handed swords or spears or halberds or things like this. While you can sort of make it work, in some cases by half-swording with a rapier, it's not really optimal. If you have a weapon which has a little bit more mass to it, then it is easier to deal with people using things like partisans and glaives and two-handed swords and things like that, or potentially cavalry swords of various sorts, other broadswords. It's easier to deal with those heavy impacts and those heavy weapons. And of course, your weapon is more likely to survive those encounters. Bear in mind, we're talking about period 17th century steel, not modern alloy steels, perfectly heat treated. These are more prone to break than modern steels are. So, a broader blade, or at least a chunkier blade and a slightly heavier blade, as well as being able to do all the other things we've just spoken about, it's also more able to deal with a bigger variety of weapons on the battlefield more easily, at least for most people, than a narrow-bladed rapier is. So the last 2 points you might not have thought of. The first one is stopping power, okay? I think that anybody who's familiar with firearms will be familiar with the fact that different types of ammunition coming out of different types of firearm have different relative stopping power. And in fact, in the 19th century, the British military in particular became obsessed with the idea of man-stopper bullets, either in revolvers or rifles, because of the nature of warfare that they were fighting in at the time in Asia and Africa and other places, where they might have charging opponents with swords or spears or whatever, and they wanted the bullet to do the job, to stop the 21-foot rule, to stop the attacker chopping them down. Now, this can apply to swords as well, and one of the sort of elephants in the room, or one of the problems with rapiers, which I have to say in HEMA, I don't think most HEMA people fully recognise, is that while you can get a hit on an opponent from a long, long way away and with a very nimble point, and that absolutely would go through most clothing, the problem is it doesn't necessarily stop them. And this is a really major problem for rapiers. And in fact, there's a bunch of strategies in the treatises for dealing with that. Not just with rapiers, but you even find this for spadroon and smallsword and sabre and other things. One of those is grappling. It's to accept the fact that your blade is going to run all the way up to the hilt, and then you're going to end up grappling with them. And of course, many times with rapier in your other hand, you have one of these, you have a dagger. So if you do run someone through, you can then parry their attack, their afterblow if it comes in, or you can start shanking them with the dagger as well, or at least keep them at bay while they try to get revenge on you with their weapon, whatever it may be. But here's the thing, if you've got a broader blade, and this is true of things like spears as well, if you think of boar spears and just generally things like partisans and stuff, if you have a broader blade, it is less likely to over penetrate. It is less likely to run all the way to the hilt. It has more percussive force, it has more friction, it has more resistance, and it is less likely to go as deep into the target. Now you could argue that makes it less good at thrusting, and well, yeah, that's true. A small sword or a narrow bladed rapier is better at thrusting. A stiletto will go into a target more easily than a kitchen knife. Yes, that's obvious. But that can be a disadvantage, and sometimes, while it's advantageous to penetrate a target well, in combat, where the opponent has also got a weapon and is also trying to hit you, sometimes it is better to penetrate less deeply and keep the opponent further away from you. So quite simply, broader blades could be advantageous in stopping power. They will still stab, but they won't over penetrate. So the fifth and final reason why in war a person might prefer to carry a broadsword rather than a rapier is quite simply the nature of rough and tumble fighting that you're likely to get in melees and skirmishes on ships, on land, in forests, in sieges, all of these different kind of situations. You are probably more likely to end up at very close distance with an opponent than you are in a duel. In a duel, unless you're in a confined space for some reason, which if it was an organised duel that wouldn't be the case, not usually anyway, who would choose to have a duel in a confined space? I don't know, letters on a postcard. But if you're keeping someone at distance, then you're fighting at point distance. However, if someone is continually ending up in your face because it is a rough, like rugby scrum kind of melee, then having an edge, again, it comes back to cutting, but anti-grabbing and anti-grappling, okay? So if you come into a bear hug with someone, or someone's coming in and trying to close to you, if you've got edges that you can use, either back edge, front edge, pushing, pulling, raking across, hamstrings, back of the neck, all of these places with an edge, but moreover, an edged blade is harder to grab and control than a narrow and not particularly finely edged thrust-centric blade. So overall, I would label this fifth and final point anti-grappling. I would say that grappling and kind of rough and tumble and perhaps even falling on the floor is more likely to happen in a battlefield or military situation than a duel. And so therefore, having the added edges, particularly front or back, but even if you've only got one edge, either against them grabbing or using them offensively when they come into wrestling distance is an advantage. So what do you think? Do you think I've covered all the points? Can you think of other ones? The fact is that a lot of people say, oh, but Matt, rapiers were used in war. Yes, absolutely they were. So I don't want you to go away from this thinking that these were only civilian swords and these were the military ones. There is a general tendency in England, in Spain, in France, in Italy, all of these places that used rapiers. There, however, does seem to be in the written text, the artistic text, the surviving swords, there is a gap, a division between the swords which were definitely more civilian focused and the swords which were definitely more military focused. In many cases, there were individuals who we know in civilian life carried a rapier with a narrow, long, pointy blade, and in military life carried forms of broadsword and backsword. Very, very common. So there's definitely a tendency. But yes, some people did carry these in war, and yes, some people did carry these in civilian life. So there was an overlap. It wasn't black and white, it was shades of grey. But the shades of grey definitely existed. Do you think I've missed any of the main points? I think I've covered the main points. Maybe I've missed some small ones. Can you think of any others? So this is the Spanish bilbao, and this is literally the military and particularly cavalry version of this Not to say these weren't carried by the Spanish in military life as well, they were, but this is the military version of it. I hope that's been useful and interesting. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.